a small, weathered town nestled between rolling hills and whispering pines. The air carried whispers of a woman named Alara, whose name was spoken in hushed tones, laden with judgment and fear. She was no ordinary figure. Her presence seemed to unsettle the very rhythm of the town's daily life. Her hair, a cascade of midnight black, fell in wild waves, and her eyes, sharp and knowing, seemed to pierce through the facades people wore. They called her the Tempest, a nickname born from tales of her fiery spirit and the chaos that seemed to trail her like a shadow. No one could pinpoint when the rumors began, but they spread like wildfire. She was cursed, they said, or perhaps a harbinger of misfortune. Shopkeepers turned her away, neighbors averted their gazes, and children were warned to steer clear. Alara lived on the outskirts, in a cottage that sagged under the weight of time, its walls stained with moss and secrets. The townsfolk believed her solitude was her own doing, a consequence of her sharp tongue and unyielding defiance. Yet, none dared to know her, to ask why her laughter never reached her eyes or why she wandered the fields alone at dusk. They judged from afar, content in their safety, their predictable lives untouched by the mystery of her existence. But the truth was far more complex than their whispers allowed. Alara had not chosen isolation. It had been thrust upon her by a town too afraid to face its own reflections in her gaze. Her past was a tapestry of loss, a parents gone too soon, a love betrayed, and dreams shattered by cruel circumstance. She carried these burdens silently, her strength mistaken for arrogance, her resilience for rebellion. The townsfolk saw only what they wanted, a woman too different, too fierce, too unknowable, and so, they refused her, closing their doors and their hearts, leaving her to wander the edges of their world. Yet, Alara was not broken. She found solace in the wild, in the rustle of leaves and the songs of birds that didn't judge. She spoke to the stars, her only companions, and in their light, she found a flicker of hope that one day, someone might see her for who she truly was, and not the Tempest, but the soul yearning for connection. The town, however, remained steadfast in its rejection, their fear a wall no one dared breach, that is, until a stranger arrived, a man named Theo, whose own scars ran deep, hidden beneath the quiet demeanor and eyes that held stories of their own. He was no hero in the traditional sense, not of knight in shining armor, but a wanderer seeking a place to belong. His arrival stirred curiosity, but it was his gaze, steady, unflinching, that caught Alara's attention one evening as she passed through the town square. Unlike the others, he didn't look away. Instead, he met her eyes, and in that moment, something shifted, a spark of possibility in a world that had long since turned its back on her. The townsfolk watched, waiting for him to recoil, to join their chorus of rejection, but Theo did not. He saw not a curse, but a challenge, not a tempest, but the soul. And so began a story that would unravel the town's tightly woven fears, one courageous step at a time. 2. Theo was no stranger to judgment himself. Having walked paths where trust was a luxury he could seldom afford, he'd come to the town by chance, or perhaps by fate, his boots worn from miles of travel and his heart heavy with memories of a life left behind. The townsfolk welcomed him cautiously, their smiles polite but their questions probing. They told him of Alara, the Tempest, weaving tales of her supposed misdeeds, how she'd once argued with the town's wealthiest merchant, how her laughter had once echoed too loudly during a solemn festival. To them, these were proof of her unworthiness, but to Theo, they hinted at a spirit unbroken by conformity. He listened, nodding, but his thoughts drifted to the woman he'd seen, her silhouette against the wall-light, moving with a grace that belied the weight she carried. He wondered what truths lay beneath the stories, what pain had shaped her defiance. Theo's own life had taught him the cost of being misunderstood. Orphaned young, he'd learned to survive on wit and resilience, often mistaken for trouble by those too quick to judge. In Alara, he sensed a kindred spirit, someone who, like him, had been shaped by loss but refused to be defined by it. The townsfolk warned him to keep his distance, their voices a chorus of caution, but Theo had never been one to heed warnings born of fear. One morning, as the sun painted the hills gold, he found himself at the edge of town, near Alara's cottage. The air was thick with the scent of pine and possibility. He knocked, not knowing what to expect, only that he couldn't ignore the pull he felt. Alara opened the door, her expression guarded, her eyes searching his for intent. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice sharp but not unkind. Theo offered a small smile, unthreatened by her edge. "Just to talk," he said simply, and in those words, she heard something rare, sincerity. They spoke for hours, first on her doorstep, then inside, where the fire cast shadows on walls lined with books and dried herbs. Alara shared fragments of her story, and not all, for trust was a fragile thing, but enough for Theo to glimpse the woman behind the myth. She spoke of her love for poetry, her dreams of seeing the sea, and the ache of being unseen. Theo listened, not with pity, but with understanding, sharing his own tales of wandering, of towns that had turned him away for being too different. The townsfolk, unaware of this meeting, continued their daily routines, oblivious to the quiet revolution unfolding at the town's edge. For Alara, it was the first time in years someone had stayed long enough to hear her, to see her without the lens of fear. For Theo, it was a chance to connect, to find meaning in a world that often felt empty. Their conversation stretched into the evening, each word a brick laid on a bridge between two solitary souls. The town slept, unaware that the tempest was no longer alone, that one man's courage had begun to unravel the chains of her exile. 3 days turned to weeks, and Theo's visits to Alara's cottage became a quiet ritual, one the townsfolk noticed with growing unease. Whispers followed him now, too, their voices tinged with suspicion. "He's bewitched," they said, "or he's a fool to trust her." But Theo was no fool, nor was he under any spell save the one woven by truth. He saw in Alara what others refused to, a woman whose fire was not destruction but passion, whose solitude was not a curse but a shield. Their meetings were simple at first, the shared stories over tea, walks through the fields where Alara pointed out wildflowers she'd named in her loneliness. But with each encounter, their bond deepened, rooted in mutual respect and the unspoken recognition of each other's wounds. Alara began to smile more, her laughter less guarded, and Theo found himself waking each morning with the purpose he hadn't known he'd lost. The townsfolk, however, saw only danger. They gathered in the tavern, their voices low but urgent, spinning theories about what drew Theo to the tempest. Some said she'd cast the spell, others claimed he sought her rumored wealth, hidden somewhere in that crumbling cottage. None considered that he might simply see her, that his courage stemmed from empathy rather than enchantment. Alara, too, felt the weight of their judgment, but Theo's presence was a balm, a reminder that she was more than the stories they told. One evening, as they sat by her hearth, she confessed her fear that the town's rejection would taint him, too, that he'd tire of the whispers and leave. Theo shook his head, his voice steady. "I've faced worse than gossip," he said, "and I've never found anyone worth knowing who didn't stir a little trouble." His words, simple yet profound, eased the knot in her chest, and for the first time, Alara dared to imagine a life not defined by solitude. Meanwhile, the town's unease grew into action. A group of elders, led by the stern-faced merchant Alara had once challenged, decided to confront Theo. They found him in the market, their faces a mix of concern and accusation. "She's trouble," the merchant warned, his voice loud enough for passers-by to hear. "You'll regret this." Theo met their gazes, unflinching. "I regret fear more than truth," he replied, and walked away, leaving them stunned. His defiance only fueled their resolve, and plans began to form ways to drive a wedge between Theo and Alara, to protect the town from what they saw as a growing threat. But Theo and Alara were no longer just two people crossing paths, they were a force, their bond a quiet rebellion against a world that thrived on fear. Each night, as the stars watched over their conversations, they built something stronger than the town's prejudice, a connection that promised to rewrite the story of the tempest, one courageous moment at a time. 4. The town's resistance grew bolder, its whispers turning to plans. The elders, backed by fearful townsfolk, devised ways to isolate Alara further, hoping to push Theo away. They refused him service at the bakery, claiming their goods were reserved for locals. They spread rumors that Alara's cottage was haunted, that her presence tainted the land. Yet, Theo remained steadfast, his resolve forged in a life of standing against judgment. He began helping Alara tend her garden, their hands working side by side in the soil, planting seeds that mirrored the hope growing between them. Alara, too, found strength in his presence, her defiance softening into something warm with trust. She showed him her poetry, verses scrawled in margins of old books, words that spoke of storms and stars and the ache of being unseen. Theo read them aloud, his voice giving life to her thoughts, and in those moments, Alara felt truly known. Their bond was not without struggle. Alara's fears of betrayal lingered, and Theo wrestled with his own doubts, wondering if he could truly belong in a town so quick to reject. But each time doubt crept in, they found solace in each other, their conversations a refuge from the world's noise. One afternoon, as they walked through the forest, Alara spoke of her parents, how their love had been her anchor until illness took them. Theo shared his own loss: a sister, lost to a fever, whose memory drove his wanderings. These confessions, raw and unguarded, wove their lives closer, each story a thread in a tapestry only they could see. The townsfolk, however, saw only disruption. A petition circulated, demanding Alara leave, claiming her influence was corrupting Theo. When he heard of it, Theo laughed, a sound that startled the petitioners. "You fear what you don't understand," he told them, his voice calm but firm. "She's no curse, she's human, same as you." His words, though true, only deepened their resolve, and the merchant rallied a group to confront Alara directly. They marched to her cottage, their faces set, but Theo stood beside her, his presence a shield. Alara faced them, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "I've done no harm," she said. "Judge me for my actions, not your fears." The crowd hesitated, some shaken by her words, others unmoved. Theo's hand brushed hers, a silent promise, and in that moment, she felt stronger than ever. The confrontation ended without resolution, but it marked a shift. To the town's fear was no longer just Alara's burden, it was a challenge they faced together. As night fell, they sat by the fire, planning not to fight, but to lie here to show the town that love and courage could outshine fear. Their bond, once a spark, was now a flame, one the town could neither extinguish nor ignore. The seasons turned, and with them, the town's campaign against Alara and Theo grew more insidious. The merchant, emboldened by the elders' support, spread lies that Alara was plotting to curse the harvest, a claim that stirred panic among the farmers. Windows shuddered when she passed, and children no longer played near her cottage. Theo, too, felt the weight of their scar. Now his work as a carpenter slowed, as townsfolk chose others over him, fearing association with the Tempest's ally. Yet, neither wavered. Alara began teaching Theo the names of herbs she grew, their uses for healing, and he marveled at her knowledge, her hands steady as she crushed leaves into salves. He, in turn, crafted a small table for her cottage, its edges carved with patterns of stars, a gift that made her eyes shine with unshed tears. Their world, though small, was rich with meaning, each act of care a defiance of the town's cruelty. One evening, a storm swept through, fierce and unrelenting, and Alara's cottage leaked under its assault. Theo worked through the night, patching the roof, his hands blistered but his heart full. Alara brought him tea, her touch lingering as she thanked him, and in the rain's rhythm, they found a quiet joy. The townsfolk, however, saw the storm as a sign, proof of Alara's curse. They gathered at the church, their voices rising in a plan to drive her out for good. Theo learned of it from a sympathetic baker, who whispered the news with a mix of fear and guilt. He and Alara prepared, not with weapons, but with resolve. When the mob arrived, led by the merchant, they found Theo and Alara standing together, unafraid. "Leave," the merchant demanded, but Alara's voice cut through the wind. "This is my home," she said, "and I'm not alone." Theo stepped forward, his gaze steady. "You fear her because she's free," he said, "but fear isn't truth." His words, simple yet piercing, silenced some, but others shouted, their anger a tide. Yet, a few hesitated, their eyes flickering with doubt. A young woman, whose mother Alara had once helped with a fever, stepped forward, her voice trembling. "She's no curse," she said. "She saved my mother." The crowd wavered, the merchant's authority cracking. Theo and Alara stood firm, their hands clasped, a symbol of unity against division. The mob dispersed, some with bowed heads, others still muttering, but the tide had turned. That night, as the storm cleared, Alara and Theo sat together, their bond stronger than ever, a beacon in a town beginning to question its own heart. 6. The confrontation at the cottage marked a turning point, though not an end to the town's division. Some began to see Alara differently, their fear softened by the young woman's words and Theo's unwavering loyalty. Others clung to their beliefs, led by the merchant, whose pride stung from the failed confrontation. Alara and Theo, however, found strength in their shared purpose. They began inviting neighbors to the cottage, and not grand gestures, but small ones: a shared meal, a salve for a sick child, a poem read aloud. Slowly, a few came, curious or desperate, and left with stories of Alara's kindness, Theo's quiet humor. The baker, who'd warned Theo, brought bread one evening, her hands shaking as she crossed the threshold. She left with a smile, her heart lighter, promising to return. Alara's garden flourished, its herbs now sought by those who once shunned her, and Theo's carpentry found new patrons among those who saw past the rumors. Yet, the merchant's influence lingered, his whispers stoking fear in those resistant to change. He rallied a final plan, a public shaming to force Alara out, claiming her presence threatened the town's prosperity. Theo and Alara learned of it through the baker, who overheard the plot. They chose not to hide but to face it, together. On the day of the town meeting, the square was packed, faces a mix of curiosity and hostility. The merchant spoke first, his voice booming with accusations, painting Alara as a blight. Then Theo stepped forward, his presence calm but commanding. He spoke of Alara's heart, her healing, her humanity, each word a challenge to their fear. Alara followed, her voice clear, not with anger but with truth. "I am no tempest," she said. "I am Alara, and I belong here as much as any of you." Her words, raw and honest, struck a chord. The young woman from the confrontation spoke again, then the baker, then others, their voices rising in defense. The merchant faltered, his authority crumbling as the crowd's mood shifted. Some apologized, others simply left, but the square emptied with a new understanding. Theo and Alara returned to the cottage, their hands still clasped, their hearts full. The town was not fully won, but cracks had formed in its wall of fear, and through those cracks, light began to shine. 7. With the merchant's influence waning, the town began to change, slowly but undeniably. Alara's cottage, once a place of dread, became a haven for those seeking her herbs or simply her company. Children, once forbidden, now played near her garden, their laughter a melody she'd never thought to hear. Theo, too, found his place, his carpentry thriving as more saw him not as the tempest's ally, but as a man of integrity. Together, they built a life, not grand but real, rooted in small acts of kindness and courage. Alara's poetry found an audience, her verses read as gatherings where once she'd been shunned. Theo crafted a bench for the town square, carved with wildflowers, a quiet tribute to their journey. Yet, scars remained of the merchant's allies still whispered, and some doors stayed closed. But Alara and Theo no longer needed the town's full approval, they had each other, and that was enough. One spring day, they walked to the hill overlooking the town, the same hill where Alara had once wandered alone. Now, Theo was beside her, their hands intertwined, the wind carrying their laughter. They spoke of the future, not grand plans, but simple ones: a trip to the sea, a garden expanded, a life shared. The town below buzzed with its usual rhythm, but it was different now, softer, as if learning to breathe with less fear. Alara looked at Theo, her eyes no longer guarded, and saw not just a man, but a mirror of her own resilience. He saw the same in her, a woman whose fire had warmed rather than burned. They sat in silence, the world around them alive with possibility, their bond a testament to what courage could achieve. The townsfolk, some still hesitant, began to tell new stories not of the tempest, but of Alara and Theo, of a love that had dared to defy fear. These stories spread beyond the town, carried by travelers, a reminder that connection could heal even the deepest divides. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Alara and Theo knew they'd found something rare, a home not in a place, but in each other. 8 years later, the town had transformed, its heart softened by the quiet revolution Alara and Theo had sparked. Alara's cottage, now repaired and vibrant, stood as a symbol of resilience, its store always open to those in need. Theo's workshop bustled, his creations adorning homes that once turned him away. The merchant had left, his influence faded, replaced by a council that included the young woman who'd first defended Alara. The town square, once a place of judgment, now hosted festivals where Alara's poetry rang out, her words weaving new dreams for those who listened. Children grew up knowing her not as the Tempest, but as the woman who taught them the names of stars. Theo and Alara, now older, their hair streaked with silver, remained the town's heart, their love a story told and retold. They never sought to be heroes, only to live truthfully, but in doing so, they'd changed the town's soul. Visitors came, drawn by tales of the couple who'd defied fear, and left with herbs, stories, and a sense of hope. Alara and Theo, now married, walked the fields each evening, their hands still clasped, their laughter a song against the dusk. The townsfolk no longer whispered of curses, but of courage, of a man who saw what others refused, and a woman who'd never stopped being herself. The stars above watched, as they always had, but now they shone on a town that had learned to see. Alara's poetry, once hidden, was now etched in the town's memory, lines of storms and stars that spoke of survival. Theo's carvings, scattered across homes and squares, told the same story in wood and care. Their life was not without struggling. Old wounds lingered, and some still held their distance, but they faced it together, their bond unbreakable. As they stood on their hill, the sea finally in their sights after a long promised journey, Alara whispered, "You saw me when no one else did." Theo smiled, his eyes crinkling. "And you gave me a reason to stay." Their story, born from one man's courage and one woman's truth, had not just changed the town, but had woven a legacy of love that would outlast them. A reminder that even in the darkest storms, a single spark of connection could light the way.